Imagine you're a raccoon. You're just out there doing raccoon things, knocking over trash cans, squeezing through holes that seem way too small for you, somehow ending up on people's security cameras at 3 in the morning. Life is good. And then, out of nowhere, a gigantic, weird primate frees you from a trap you couldn't get out of. What do you do with that information? Do you process it? Do you realize what just happened? Do you wander off thinking, that was weirdly helpful? Or is it just another random event in a world that doesn't make any sense? Because that question, whether wild animals actually understand when a human is helping them, sounds pretty simple. But it's actually one of the most fascinating rabbit holes you can fall into. And by the end of this video, I promise you'll never look at wild animals the same way ever again. First, let's get something out of the way. Animals are not dumb. I know that sounds obvious, but for a really long time, scientists thought animals were basically living machines. They weren't thinking. They weren't reasoning things out. They were just reacting to whatever happened around them. In fact, the idea became so common that it eventually got its own rule. In the late 1800s, a scientist named Lloyd Morgan came up with an idea that became known as Morgan's Canon. The basic rule was, don't assume an animal is doing something complicated if a simpler explanation works just as well. So if your dog suddenly acts guilty when you find a chewed-up shoe, Morgan would say, hold on, maybe the dog isn't feeling guilt at all. Maybe it doesn't understand that it did something wrong. Maybe it simply learned that when you find something you're not happy about, your face changes, your voice changes, and when that happens, keeping its head down is usually the safest option. In other words, the dog isn't reacting to the shoe, it's reacting to you. And to be fair, sometimes the simple explanation really is the right one. If a moth keeps flying into a porch light, it doesn't mean it's having an existential crisis. Sometimes an animal is just responding to a stimulus. But here's the problem. We got so committed to simple explanations that we started using them everywhere. For decades, the idea that animals might have rich inner lives, that they could understand intentions, navigate social relationships, or make sense of context was largely dismissed. In many academic circles, suggesting otherwise wasn't just controversial, it was seen as unscientific, naive, even a little embarrassing. And then the research started coming in. And it turned out animals were capable of a lot more than we'd given them credit for. One of the most remarkable cases happened in Kenya in 2004. Wildlife conservationist Ian Douglas Hamilton was flying over Samburu National Reserve when he noticed a female elephant acting oddly. She wasn't moving with the rest of the herd. Instead, she kept circling the same area and looking up toward the aircraft. When he went to investigate, he found out why. A young calf had fallen into a deep, mud-filled pit and couldn't get out. The mother had clearly been trying to help, but there was only so much she could do. She stayed close, refusing to abandon the calf, and here's the interesting part. When rescuers arrived, the mother didn't attack them or chase them away. She stepped back and watched as conservation workers used ropes and manpower to pull the exhausted calf to safety. The moment it was free, the mother rushed over and the two walked away together. Think about what that means for a second. This was a wild elephant, not trained, not accustomed to asking humans for help. Just an animal facing a problem it could not solve alone. Did the mother understand that humans might be able to do something she couldn't? Did she intentionally tolerate their presence because it gave her calf a chance? We can't know exactly what was happening in her mind. But whatever the answer is, it's hard to dismiss this as a simple automatic behavior. The mother recognized that her calf was in trouble. She kept trying to help. And when another option appeared, she responded very differently than she would have to an ordinary threat. Did she understand that the rescue had succeeded? Did she feel something like relief when her calf was finally out? Nobody can say for sure. But stories like this keep showing up in places all over the world. Different animals, different situations. At the very least, that's worth paying attention to. Now let's talk about crows. Because if there is any animal that completely breaks the idea that wild animals don't pay attention to us, it's crows. These birds are terrifyingly intelligent. They solve puzzles. They use tools. They plan ahead. They recognize individual human faces, and most importantly, they remember who screwed them over. Researchers at the University of Washington wore specific masks while trapping crows. Later, they walked around campus wearing either normal masks or the trapping mask, and the crows remembered. They didn't just react to a human, they reacted to that face. But it gets crazier. Other crows started attacking the mask too. Crows that had never been trapped. Crows that weren't even there when it happened. Somehow, crows you've never met have opinions about you, which means, on some level, crows talked shit about you. They gossiped. And the flip side is even more interesting. Crows also remember kindness. People who feed crows sometimes find little objects left behind. Buttons, bottle caps, pieces of glass, tiny weird offerings placed exactly where the food usually appears. Maybe the crow doesn't think, "Here is a gift, dear human friend," but it knows the relationship. It knows you are the creature that gives, and sometimes it gives back. So now imagine that same brain in a rescue situation. A crow is trapped. A human walks up. Every instinct should be screaming, fly away, bite, panic, escape. But instead, it stays still long enough to be helped. That matters. Because this is not an animal living in a blur. This is an animal that remembers faces, tracks behavior, spreads warnings, rewards kindness, and updates its opinion of you over time. So when a crow lets a human help it, there may be a lot more happening than fear and reflex. It may be making a calculation, not in words, not like a human sitting there thinking through a spreadsheet, but in that fast, ancient animal way. This creature is close. This creature is dangerous. But this creature might also be useful. And if I survive this, I will remember. Now, to be fair, there's an obvious counterargument here. Maybe the animal isn't understanding help at all. Maybe it's exhausted. Maybe it's injured. Maybe it's terrified. Maybe it's simply reached a point where the immediate problem is so overwhelming that it stops caring about the fact that a human is standing right next to it. In that version of the story, the animal isn't making some sophisticated judgment about human intentions. It's just out of options. And honestly, that's a fair point. In some cases, that may be exactly what's happening. But here's where it gets more interesting. Researchers keep finding examples of what they call pro-social behavior. Animals helping other animals with no obvious benefit to themselves. One of the strangest examples comes from humpback whales. Over and over again, researchers have observed humpbacks interfering with orca hunts. Sometimes they're protecting another whale, but not always. There are documented cases involving seals, sea lions, and other animals that have absolutely nothing to do with humpbacks. Think about how weird that is. A humpback whale hears the sounds of an orca attack, swims over, and inserts itself into a situation that isn't its problem. In some cases, it physically positions its massive body between the predator and the prey. Why? We don't actually know. But whatever the answer is, it's very difficult to explain as simple self-interest. And that's where things get messy. Because knowing that an animal can help another animal is not the same thing as knowing that it understands help. Those are two different questions. An animal might see that another creature is in distress and respond to that distress. But that's not necessarily the same thing as understanding what the other creature needs, or understanding why a particular action helps. And that distinction turns out to matter a lot. So how do you test whether an animal understands intentions instead of just outcomes? One clever experiment looked at exactly that. Imagine you're a monkey sitting in front of two humans. One of them helps another person open a container and get what they want. The other makes things harder. They interfere. They get in the way. They act like a jerk. The monkey isn't involved. Nothing is happening to it. It's just watching. Then both humans offer the monkey food. Who does it choose? Researchers in Japan ran versions of this experiment with capuchin monkeys, and the results were surprisingly consistent. The monkeys overwhelmingly preferred taking food from the helpful person. But here's the part that really matters. The helpful or unhelpful behavior wasn't directed at the monkey. The monkey was judging how one human treated somebody else. Think about what that means. The monkey wasn't just keeping track of who was nice to it personally. It was paying attention to social interactions, forming an opinion, and carrying that information forward into a future decision. In other words, it was watching, and it was judging. A monkey is sitting there observing two strangers interact and deciding which one it trusts. That's a remarkable thing for an animal to be doing, because it suggests that at least some animals aren't just responding to what happens to them, they're paying attention to what happens around them, and they're drawing conclusions. Now, before we get too carried away, there's something important we need to talk about. Sometimes a wild animal isn't staying still because it trusts you. Sometimes it's staying still because it's terrified. Wildlife rehabilitators have a name for this: tonic immobility. Under extreme stress, some animals essentially shut down. They freeze. They stop struggling. From the outside, it can look almost peaceful, like they've accepted what's happening, but they haven't. They're overwhelmed. And that's important because it means we have to be careful. Just because an animal lets a human get close doesn't automatically mean it understands what's happening. It doesn't automatically mean trust. But here's the interesting part. The people who work with wild animals every day will tell you there is a difference. An animal that's frozen with fear doesn't look the same as an animal that's genuinely settled down. The breathing is different. The body language is different. The eyes are different. One experienced raptor rehabilitator described birds that, after weeks of recovery, would turn toward the sound of her footsteps specifically, not other staff, not strangers, her. Not because she was feeding them, not because they suddenly forgot she was a human, but because, over time, she had become associated with something very specific: safety. Call that trust. Call it learned association. Call it whatever you want. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that it's different from fear. Now let's get to the case that stops everyone cold. In 2011, rescuers off the California coast found a humpback whale tangled in fishing lines. The ropes were wrapped around its mouth, its fins, and parts of its body. It had been struggling for hours, so a team of divers got in the water. Think about how insane that is for a second. You're swimming next to an animal the size of a bus, 50 feet long, tens of thousands of pounds. An animal that could kill you by accident without even realizing you'd been there. And then something remarkable happened. The whale held still. For more than an hour, divers swam around its body, cutting away lines one by one. At any moment, the whale could have panicked. One violent movement could have killed the divers, tangled the lines further, or turned the entire rescue into a disaster. But it didn't. It stayed there while these tiny, strange creatures worked all around it. And then, the last line came free. This is where the story gets weird. The whale didn't just immediately vanish into the ocean. Instead, it circled back. One by one, it approached the divers who had been working on it. Slowly, deliberately. One diver described feeling a gentle nudge. Not a collision. Not an accidental brush from a 50-ton animal trying to get its bearings. A nudge. Another recalled the whale stopping so close that its eye was level with his face. Just picture that for a second. You're floating in the open ocean, and an animal weighing dozens of tons is looking directly at you from a few feet away. An eye bigger than your fist. A mind that evolved in a completely different world. And for a moment, the two of you are just looking at each other. Now, could there be simpler explanations? Absolutely. Maybe the whale was disoriented after being trapped. Maybe it was curious. Maybe it was simply investigating the strange creatures that had been swimming around it for the last hour. Those are all reasonable possibilities. But here's the detail that people keep coming back to. The whale didn't seem interested in everybody equally. It appeared to approach the divers who had actually been cutting the lines, the individuals who had been working on freeing it. And that's where the story becomes difficult to dismiss with a shrug. Because now, we're no longer talking about a whale reacting to a situation. We're talking about a whale potentially reacting to specific individuals within that situation. Did it fully understand what those divers had done? Probably not in the way a human would. But did something register? Did it connect those particular creatures with the fact that it was suddenly free? At the very least, that's starting to look like a possibility we can no longer dismiss. So let's zoom out for a second and ask the bigger question. Why would a wild animal have any ability to recognize help from a human in the first place? On the surface, it doesn't make much sense. For most of history, if a wild animal saw a human approaching, that was bad news. Humans hunted animals, trapped them, captured them. The safest response was usually to run. So where does this openness come from? Well, it might not be about humans at all. Think about the kinds of animals we've been talking about throughout this video. Dolphins, crows, elephants, primates, wolves. These are all highly social animals. Every day they have to figure out what the individuals around them are about to do. Is that animal approaching to help me or challenge me? Is it a threat or an ally? Can I trust it? Should I get closer or farther away? Their survival depends on getting those decisions right. In other words, they spend their entire lives reading behavior, reading intentions, reading social cues. And once evolution builds a tool like that, there's no reason it should only work on members of the same species. A crow doesn't need a special human module in its brain. A dolphin doesn't need to understand what a scuba diver is. All they have to do is recognize the signals, slow movements, a lack of aggression, actions that consistently lead to good outcomes instead of bad ones. From that perspective, a whale reading a diver isn't doing anything extraordinary. It's doing what it always does. It's reading another mind as best it can. Which leads to a surprisingly simple idea. Maybe wild animals don't understand human kindness because they understand humans. Maybe they understand it because they understand kindness, or at least the behavioral signals that tend to go along with it. The body doesn't matter. The species doesn't matter. The signal is the signal.